Hi, this is Arthur, and you're listening to Kat Calvin, founder and executive director of Spread the Vote on Two Broads Talking Politics. Go get your vaccine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics, and I'm on today with a returning guest. This is Kat Calvin, who's the founder and executive director of Spread the Vote. Hi, Kat.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. So it's been a while since we last talked. I think you were on once in 2018 and then a little over a year ago in March of 2020. So I feel like the whole world has changed since then, multiple times over.
In so many ways.
So very, very many ways. So first, in case people don't remember from last time, just tell us a little intro on what Spread the Vote is and what you do.
Sure. So Spread the Vote is a nonprofit organization. We primarily do two things every day of the year. We help people get government-issued photo ID. There are over 21 million eligible voters who don't have ID, which you, of course, need for jobs, housing, medical care. Upsettingly, COVID testing and vaccines in most places, all sorts of things. But you also need ID to vote in 36 states and more so with this sort of new slew of voter suppression bills that are passing. And so we make sure that people have IDs. And then during elections, we do a lot of voter education and help people get to the polls.
And I think since last time we talked, Spread the Vote has expanded to more states. So what all states are you in now, or how many? I suppose you don't have to list them all.
Every time I try to list them all, I get it wrong. We're in or are currently launching in 17 states. You can go to spreadthevote.org/states and see them all because I can no longer do the list.
That's exciting, though, that it's so many. So let's talk then some about general reasons people might not have an ID. And then I suspect, having just gone through the process of renewing my own driver's license, that this is all very exacerbated right now. But what's some of the sort of reasons that people might not have a government-issued ID?
Yeah, well, for anyone who's ever been to the DMV, which hilariously, I actually have a friend who needed to get her license renewed, went today, couldn't get it done, but I need to get my real ID. So we're like getting up at the butt crack of dawn to go tomorrow. So like we all know how difficult it is to like get to the DMV. And I live in California where they actually make it pretty easy and it's still ridiculous. And that's just sort of for every day. But, IDs, first of all, when you go to the DMV, any DMV in any state, you need a huge stack of documents. You need birth certificates, you need proofs of residency and identity and all of these different things, which can be really difficult to get, particularly if you look at the percentage of folks who don't have ID. One way that it's easy to think about this is if you don't have ID, you can't work legally, right? Which means that it's the folks that we are working with are mostly unemployed or under the table employed, which is often worse than being unemployed. A lot of people who are unhoused, a lot of returning citizens. We have a huge crisis of people without disability or with disabilities, not having IDs, et cetera. And so when you look at the challenges of, say, getting a birth certificate, that's already annoying enough for anybody. But when you may not have a home or may not have the money, then it can be really complicated. If you go to Vital Records in most states and ask for a birth certificate, they ask for your ID. So we have to use a very expensive and complicated way to help folks get IDs. Same thing if you need a social security card, who you get it when you're like a baby and then, who can hold on to it, right? The types of documents that they ask for can be easy if you're a person with a home who has utility bills and all these different things, but it's not as easy if you don't. And so, folks don't have ID, often because they never got it. We work with a lot of young people who, their parents can't help them with sort of the funds or getting the documents. We have a huge problem in this country with foster kids turning 18 and literally just being dumped out on the streets without any documents. We also have, folks who, once you become homeless, your chances of losing your documents obviously significantly increase. And so we have folks who may have been evicted due to job loss or who went bankrupt because of medical issues. We're in a lot of storm-prone states where we have folks who lose their homes because of hurricanes or fires or whatever. And then once they're out on the streets, you either lose your documents, someone steals them. We've helped a lot of people who the police have, burned or thrown away all of their documents, and then all of a sudden they don't have anything. We also have a lot of returning citizens. When you're released from prison, they tell you, go get a job and a place to live, but they don't give you the ID that you need to do that. And so, there's so many reasons. We also, part of the reason that people don't really recognize yet this huge ID crisis that we have is that it's actually relatively new. It's one of the results of changes that were made after 9/11. And so, we have a lot of folks who are elderly who had an ID 20 years ago, but then in the meantime, their ID has been lost or stolen or expired, etc. And all of a sudden they can't get one because the requirements are so much more stringent. And there are a lot of elderly people who never had a birth certificate, right? Or have all these different circumstances. And so they found themselves now in a situation where they can't get an ID, but they could get one, 20 years before. So there are a ton of reasons. I think one thing that is very clear to me after doing this work for so long is that, we're all really just like two medium-sized disasters away from being homeless. What is the stat that like 60% of Americans don't have $400 in an emergency, or maybe be like higher than that, right? And for so many of the people we help, it really is just, this one thing happened and then this other thing, and there was no safety net, and then they ended up on the streets or this or that, and then they didn't have an ID, and so they couldn't get a job, they couldn't get housing. There's so many food banks that won't give you food if you don't have an ID. There's shelters that won't let you sleep there if you don't have ID, etc. And then it just becomes this impossible thing where if they couldn't get that plastic card, they couldn't start their lives over again.
Yeah. And, I don't know if people have tried to go recently. You mentioned you're going tomorrow to get your ID. A lot of DMVs were closed for a significant stretch during the pandemic. So I had to go. My license was, they kept extending the time, but that means there's a huge backlog of people who need to go. So my husband and I had to go a couple weeks ago, and it was like an all-day affair to take the train to the one DMV that's open, stand in line for 2 hours. Like, it's a really big process, even for people who are relatively privileged, and this is fairly easy to do. So what are the ways that your organization can help? Like, what are the pieces that you can do to help people that are in these situations, to help them get their IDs?
So we do everything. We help get every piece of documentation that you need. So when we first meet a client, we go through and say, all right, in order to get an ID, in Texas, you need these 5 things. Which of them do you have? Which of them don't you have? And then we help them get each piece that they don't have, whether it's going to government offices or doing it online. We pay for everything. We, call departments of corrections or hospitals, whatever we have to do. We get all of the documents that are required, and then we provide transportation to the DMV. And, and yes, making appointments lately and like getting in, for a while, it was impossible. Now even the Social Security administrations are still closed and DMVs have limited hours. So it's a real challenge. We have a waiting list too, but we get each person to the DMV and we do whatever, pay for everything, advocate for them there, make sure that they get an ID in their hand. So we help with every piece of the process.
And how do people find out about your organization? How does it come to their attention that you are a group of people who can help with this process?
So a few ways. One of the big things that we do is we partner with local organizations in every city we're in that serve the same demographic, but that cannot help with the ID piece. So a lot of shelters, food banks, jails and departments of corrections, and organizations that work with returning citizens, organizations that work with students or people with disabilities or whatever. And we partner with them because they are usually serving their clients and communities in a lot of other ways, but they don't have the funds or expertise to help with the ID piece. So we help with the ID piece. So that's a big part. We have volunteers and staff who go to, the same shelter every, Tuesday from 3 to 6 and have for 4 years now. And so everyone knows they're there. Word of mouth is pretty huge. You know, we work with a lot of different social workers and caseworkers. So there's a lot of both us just partnering with organizations and being in the community. And then at this point, because we've helped so many people get IDs and we've been in these communities for so long, that people will just say, oh, my friend told me that you helped him get an ID. And they'll sort of know where to find us. So it's really, we try to put our tentacles out in as many places as possible. But, you know, we're the only national ID obtaining org. There's some really great sort of local ones in some different areas, but it's really rare for there to be an organization that can help with everything to get an ID and that pays for everything. And so usually it doesn't take long once we show up somewhere to have like hordes of people who are like, oh my God, you're this piece that we needed.
Well, with that, you know, if someone came and, you know, dropped $1 billion on you or something, you know, what are there like backlogs of people that you could help? What does this size of this estimated population look like?
Well, there's over 21 million eligible voters who don't have ID, which is really the only study that's been done, and it was done a little bit ago. You know, estimations of orgs in this space is that it's probably closer to 25 or 26 million adults that don't have ID in the country. There's no shortage of people, right? So if someone gave me $1 billion, I would just get more IDs, because it's at this point, you know, we know what we're doing. We know how to do it. We're very good at that. It's just that there are just so many people, who need IDs. You know, every state has hundreds of thousands to millions of people who don't have ID. And for us, it's just a matter of just trying to help as many people as possible. It's, you know, it's not super easy. It takes usually a few weeks to help someone gather all the documents and et cetera and get there. And that's even pre-COVID. Now, you know, who knows? So it's really, you know, we will never run out of people. And this is why we started a 501c4 last summer, to try to work on changing policy in states to make it easier for more people to get IDs, because as hard as we'll try, we're never going to get 21 million people IDs. But if we can try to change legislation so that, you know, every vet gets a free ID, every person experiencing homelessness or whatever, and try to expand that, then we can help 21 million people get IDs on a larger scale. Because yeah, we'll never run out, unfortunately.
Yeah. So you mentioned there's a lot of reasons that people need ID, a lot of things that ID can be used for. One of those things, of course, is voting. What does that look like after people get IDs? The people that you're helping, for instance, do they then go and vote? Do they become voters?
Yeah, so a large percentage do. 77% of our clients have never voted before. We've had sort of first-time voters from ages 0 to 79. And, you know, once we help folks get IDs, and we don't have any requirements for who we help. They don't have to be eligible to vote. They don't have to be citizens. You know, they can be undocumented, whatever. But about 80% of our clients are eligible to vote. We register about 92% of those. And then work very hard, you know, when elections come up to help those folks get to the polls. We make election guides that we print out because only 1% of our clients have access to a phone regularly. So like internet access isn't a thing. So we print them out. We do community events. We walk people through guides. We help them make voter plans. We pick them up. We take them to the polls, et cetera. And so, you know, we do a lot of hands-on work during elections to make sure that once we help folks get the IDs they need for their lives, you know, then are able to sort of talk to them about voting, that we're then helping with all of the steps. Because if we just get them an ID and register them and walk away, they're never going to be able to overcome the 85 other micro barriers that make it so difficult for people to vote. So we try to help them with every piece of it.
So a lot of states, of course, are going in the opposite direction of what we'd like to see, making it harder to get IDs, making it harder to vote. What are some of the kinds of policy changes that would help in this space, that would help people be able to get IDs, that would help these populations be able to vote without a lot of barriers?
Well, we need two things. You know, almost every developed country in the world, and even a lot of developing countries in the world, just have a national ID that people just get, right? And they make it very easy to get. They don't put all these barriers in place. And that's what we should have is, you know, when you turn 16 or 18, you should just be able to walk into a DMV and get an ID. You know, it's the government they know where I am right now, what I'm wearing, what I had for breakfast. They know. And we know because sometimes someone will just pull something up on the computer because like we're having such a challenge and somebody cries and they're like, well, here it is right here. It's like, I know it's all in the system. And so, you know, what we need is like every other country to have a national ID. Or for states to just have state IDs and just make sure everybody gets one. That would eliminate a lot of these problems. If people had IDs, they could get jobs, they could get housing, right? Like they could get all of these things. And so it would eliminate a lot of the problems up front. If we had a national ID and then you wanted to have voter ID laws, fine. If everybody has shoes, then you can require that people have to wear shoes, right, to go to vote. The problem is that 21 million plus people don't have an ID. And so then when you say, well, you have to have this thing to vote, even though we know that 11% of the population doesn't have it and can't get it because we've made it so difficult, then we have, that's a problem. So HR 1, SR 1, that's in Congress right now, the For the People Act, effectively ends voter ID laws. It still requires that people sign an affidavit, which is BS and they shouldn't have to. But it's a fight I'm willing to have after it gets passed. But we need to make sure everyone has an ID because you need it for everything and for life. But if before we do that or until we do that, then we need to get rid of voter ID laws. Everyone who is for voter ID laws talks about voter fraud, which everybody knows at this point is not a thing. Every study has shown it almost never happens, right? So we all know that's BS. There's really no reason for it except to stop people from voting. So my two big chase, if I had a magic wand and I could just sort of make two national policy changes, we'd get rid of voter ID laws and we'd make sure everybody has an ID.
Can I get that magic wand after you're done with it?
Yeah.
I've got a few things I'd like to change.
I'll FedEx it to you.
All right. So we're talking in sort of large numbers and impacts and things like that. But what does it mean for individuals who are able to get ID? Do you have stories of the people that you've been able to help and what that's done in their individual lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything. It's one of the first things that people ask when they get an ID is they'll usually turn to the volunteer or like field staffer and say, can you take me to the mall or take me wherever I want to apply for a job, right? Like that's a huge piece. It's the first thing people say. They say, I'm a person again because you're not without an ID. And they want to apply for a job. It just busts sort of this myth that like people don't want to work. Everybody wants to work. People want to work with fair wages and, preferably health insurance and a few days off. But like people want to work. And it's the first thing people say is, oh, I can apply for a job now. And that is huge. And then, housing, you can't get housing without an ID. You can't get placed into housing assistance without an ID, so when we work with, homeless shelters that have programs where they can help people get placed in housing, but they can't do it without an ID. And so it's the basics. People want jobs, people get housing, people are able to get, medical care. We work with a network of sober living centers because people can't get into rehab without IDs, right? So it's all of these sort of basic life things that the rest of us take for granted, that are the things that are most important, and then there's other things we don't think about. Like you can't open a bank account without ID, right? And I won't even get into the problems with the unbanked in this country. But, like we had a client who her husband had died like 16 years before, but she didn't have an ID and she was this, elderly lady and they had a joint bank account, but she couldn't access it without an ID. So she couldn't access any of her funds. And her son had also been in prison for 13 years. And you can't visit someone in prison if you're over 16 without an ID. So for 16 years, she hadn't been able to access any of her own money that was, hers after her husband died in their joint account. And she couldn't visit her son. And these are two really critically important things. And then we had to jump through some hoops because there were these complications, which is why she didn't have an ID in the first place. And then when we finally got it for her, it was like, oh, I have money to live now. And I can visit my son for the first time in over a decade, and it's things like that feel little, but that for you in your life are huge, and it's just being able to, we work with centers, and organizations that work with people with disabilities who are trying to be placed into independent living situations, but need an ID to do so. But like having that freedom as a person with a disability to have your own home and to have control of your life is so important and is a thing that, everyone deserves, but that we make much more difficult. And so it's all of the little things, right? Like no one's ever come to us and said, I need an ID so I can get on a plane for a vacation to Hawaii, right? It's I need a job. My very favorite, though, we did have a guy who said, oh, I can finally go to a bar where nobody knows me, right? But that's a big deal. It's the freedom and the independence and being a human being. But for the folks we work with, it's, I want a job. I want a place to live. I want to be able to feed my kids. Like, I just want to be a person.
Well, I suspect that no one listening has $1 billion to throw at you, but I also suspect that people listening want to give you money right now to continue this work. So how can they do that, and how else can they help?
Well, if you have an uncle with $1 billion, or if you know Jeff Bezos or something, just tell him, first of all, pay your people fair wages, but then give the rest of the money to us. But if not, every dollar counts seriously. Our average ID cost is $40. So, we're really, it's small increments that together make big change. You can go to spreadthevote.org/donate, which is an awesome place to contribute. And you can also go to spreadthevote.org/volunteer if you'd like to get involved.
Excellent. And I strongly encourage people to follow Spread the Vote on social media too, because there's always these heartwarming stories of what people are able to do with their IDs. So is there anything else, Kat, that you want to make sure that we talk about today?
The big thing, if you know anybody who lives in West Virginia, please ask them to call Joe Manchin's office 5 times a day and tell him that we need filibuster reform so that we can then pass the For the People Act. So everybody, don't call his office if you don't live in West Virginia. That won't help anybody at all. Call whoever your senators are and just remind them this is the thing that we want, and to maybe take some cookies over to Joe Manchin and try to bribe him. But if you know anyone in West Virginia, they really need to call him, because he right now is the one thing standing in the way of us passing the biggest voting rights act since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court already gutted once and they're about to gut again. So we desperately need this, and it's all in the hands of one man in West Virginia. So call everyone. If you don't know people in West Virginia, make friends with people in West Virginia on social media, get a phone book, I don't know, and then beg them to call Joe Manchin's office every few seconds.
Agreed. Co-signed. And bills aren't always the most elegantly named, but I really like the name For the People Act, because how can you say I'm against the people? I'm against the For the People Act.
So many people are. It's incredible.
Yes, indeed. Well, on that note, everyone go to spreadthevote.org/donate and help people get IDs. And then let's find everyone we know in West Virginia to call Joe Manchin.
Please, for the love of God. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Kat.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.